Hi, and welcome to Chapter 18. This is the chapter on pest control and pesticides, which are the chemicals that are used to control pests. Pesticides have quite a long history of use. Back in the 1860s, there was a concoction called Paris Green that was used as an insecticide and a fungicide. It had a very high concentration of arsenic. And in fact, arsenic was a very popular pesticide into the 19th century. In 1939, DDT was discovered, or it was created, and that was a very effective insecticide. It was used very widely and is still used in some parts of the world for controlling mosquitoes that carry malaria. DDT and other chlorinated pesticides were really responsible for changing food production worldwide because DDT is a very cheap pesticide. It's very easy to use, it's very easy to make. And until 1962, when Rachel Carson published her book Silent Spring, the public was really not very aware of some of the risks associated with pesticide use. It's estimated that the total cost of pesticide use in the US is $12 billion. That takes into account the effects on public health, on livestock, on the cost to make new pesticides when insects become resistant. It also takes into account wildlife losses, including honeybees, and the amount of money for the U.S. government to approve pesticides. So in the U.S., the EPA has established 7 different categories of public health pests. Those 7 are listed here. Cockroaches do not transmit many diseases, but they do create allergens just in their dust and when their shells break down, they create dust. The second category are lice. These can create irritations and rashes. There aren't that many diseases that are carried by them. The third category is mosquitoes, and we all know about the diseases that mosquitoes can carry. The next category are rats and mice. Some of the rodent-borne diseases can be transmitted through the feces, which can be found in a lot of different places, and these can contaminate food. Next are the microorganisms, things like bacteria, viruses, and protozoa. It's very important that these things are controlled in hospitals, so when people are going to get surgeries, they don't come home with infections. Some reptiles and birds can carry diseases or cause injuries to people. And then various mammals can be public health pests. And one example is some of the populations that can carry rabies. So when we talk specifically about mosquitoes and other insect pests, we all are very familiar with hearing about the diseases that mosquitoes can carry. Mosquitoes are a very good vector for many of the human diseases. We've all recently heard about Zika and how it's been in the news, and that's one of the newest types of viruses that have been transmitted through mosquitoes. But you can see that 4 of the main species of mosquitoes are listed here, along with some of the diseases that they can carry. Bedbugs are also a common insect pest, and they don't transmit any diseases, but they are quite a nuisance. They're very hard to get rid of. They can hide in a mattress for sometimes up to a year and come out and take one very big bite of a human to get enough blood to last them for another very long period of time. Fleas are also very common insect pests. These often travel along with our dogs and cats. Termites are another insect pest that they don't cause irritation, or they don't really cause any public health concerns, but they do cost millions of dollars in damage. And then, of course, ticks, which we deal with a lot here in Vermont. These ticks can carry Lyme disease, which is a very serious disease that is very common here in Vermont, as well as the other states in New England. And ticks can also carry other diseases such as anaplasmosis. So when we think about pesticides, the pesticides are the chemicals that are intended to kill the pests. So we've gone through this list of pests that are very annoying, and people definitely seek ways to kill them. When we think about classifying pesticides, they can be classified according to the target pest. So fungicides will kill fungi, or mode of action. And the mode of action can be based on the target that the pesticide interferes with in order to kill the insect. There are 4 common insecticide classes that are discussed in the chapter. Those are organophosphates, which are abbreviated OPs, carbamates, which are very similar to OPs, organochlorines, and pyrethroids, and we'll spend a couple of minutes talking about each one of those. The organophosphates are a very serious category of insecticides. They work very well on insecticides, but there's no selectivity for distinguishing between humans and pests. So the organophosphates work by inhibiting acetylcholinesterase, which is a very important enzyme that humans need in order to stop our muscles from twitching. Some of the different organophosphates are listed there: chlorpyrifos, diazinon, and malathion. The structures of these pesticides are very close to the structure of sarin, soman, and VX, which were all nerve gases, which are very toxic. The organophosphates have a shorter half-life in the environment. The acute toxicity is very severe. But there's also concern for chronic low-level exposure. There have been some studies of people exposed through food or through immigrant farm workers who are bringing pesticides home to a large population. Children who are born to those families can have adverse neurological outcomes. There are many uses in the U.S., so there aren't many uses of organophosphates anymore in the U.S. because our EPA has banned the most of the indoor uses for these harmful class of pesticides, but globally they are still used. And generally speaking, in the world, the worldwide consumption of pesticides is about 2 million metric tons per year, which is a lot of chemical. 45% of it is in Europe, 25% in the US. The US use of pesticides has decreased since from 2007 to 2000. It has decreased about 8%, which is a good thing. During that same time frame, organophosphates have also gone down about 63%. So that tells us that when we discover that chemicals are very toxic, that our country does have a way to phase them out, even if it's slowly. The organochlorine pesticides are very persistent chemicals, and so this is opposed to the organophosphates, which degrade very quickly. These stick around for a very long time and get concentrated in fat. They were widely used in the first half of the 20th century. We mentioned DDT already. You might have also heard about chlordane, which used to be used for lice. They're just like DDT, these are very effective, very cheap. But since they are stored in the fat, they can bioconcentrate up the food chain. They're found in the fat of pretty much any food that contains fat, such as meat, dairy, fish. They have acute toxicity, so you are concerned about a large dose giving quite a severe reaction in a human, but just like organophosphates, there's concern for the low chronic exposure. In 2004, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants called for a ban of this type of pesticide. They are still used in some locations, but not as the first option. Some other pesticides that are commonly used are the pyrethroids. The pyrethroids are modeled after a naturally occurring chemical found in chrysanthemum plants. The structure was modified to make the insecticide more resistant to UV light, more stable. In general, these are a pretty good class of insecticides. They don't have very severe human toxicity. There are other types of pesticides, biopesticides, that are derived from natural materials. A lot of these are used in conjunction with genetic engineering. So the Bt gene, the Bacillus thuringiensis gene, can be engineered into plants, and the plant will produce that toxin which will kill only the insects. There are also other biochemical pesticides and insect pheromones, which are hormones that insects have that humans don't have. There are also a lot of herbicides that are very widely used. The two that have, and we've talked about a couple of these in some of our previous discussions, glyphosate and atrazine. These are very common surface water contaminants, and in the United States, it's very difficult to find surface water that's not contaminated with one of these two herbicides. And the EPA does allow quite a lot of it to be present in drinking water, and those levels were established decades ago based on outdated science. So when we think about pesticide exposure and the public health concerns, it is very common for people to use pesticides in their home. About 80% of all U.S. households use at least one type of pesticide. Some of the pesticides that are used indoors can volatilize into the air, then they can settle to house dust, and it's very common for children to be exposed to pesticides either accidentally or just as a byproduct of using them inside the house. Occupational exposures are very common among farm workers, and unintentional poisonings are very common for pesticides. So either people working in agriculture or pet groomers or even self-poisonings, people, especially in other countries, choose to ingest a large amount of pesticide in order to commit suicide. So when we think about regulation in the US, there are three main rules or main laws that protect the public from pesticides. The first is FIFRA, and FIFRA really established the process for registering a pesticide. And this is what the EPA is in charge of, handling all the toxicity data and establishing the proper labeling and training and determining which pesticides can be used by the general public and which have to be used by registered applicators. The next law is the FFDCA, which is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This is a really general act, but it does apply to pesticides in food because it required EPA to set health-based tolerances or permissible levels for food. So here we have a law that says the EPA has to decide what level of pesticide is safe for people to eat in their food. And some of those decisions might be fairly obvious based on acute toxicity, but some of those decisions can be very difficult. It can be very difficult to determine what a safe level of pesticide residue is on your food when you're thinking about chronic exposure and some of these health outcomes that are very difficult to see in the general population. And the last law is the Food Quality Protection Act, and this is fairly recent. It was in 1996, and it required an extra safety factor to protect infants and children. And globally speaking, a lot of nations do not have laws about pesticides. Developing countries do use a small proportion of the world's agrochemicals of pesticides, but they account for 99% of the pesticide poisoning. So that tells you that the pesticides that are allowed to be used there are often more toxic. They have very lax regulations about how they're stored and handled. The United Nations does have a set of maximum residue levels that are established for pesticides in food, and outside of the US, countries may adopt them, but they may choose not to adopt them. And the last topic is integrated pest management. So integrated pest management was developed back in the 1960s, and this is an idea, or it's an approach to treating pests that focuses on making conditions less favorable for pests. So in general, people try to do everything they can before using chemicals to make the environment less suitable for pests. So some examples can be farmers can use different management, different cultural practices. They can plant different types of plants that will get rid of certain types of pests. For public health officials, instead of spraying an entire town for using chemicals to prevent mosquitoes, they can ask everyone to dump out all the standing water. So this is a really popular method. It's used a lot in schools where you have vulnerable populations. Again, it focuses on using chemicals as a completely last resort. So hopefully this has been a good introduction to pesticides, and we will do more discussion on the boards. Thank you.